Hi, this is Anne at Yarnfolk, and I am going to do a short video today on how to tell the difference between various weights of yarn. This is probably one of the most frequent questions that I get in the shop. How do I tell the difference between a lace and a fingering or a sport or a DK? What are the differences between the weights of yarn? And how I'm going to do this so that this doesn't get too terribly long is I'm going to divide the video up into lighter weight yarns today, so I'll be covering lace weight through DK, and then next week I will talk about worsted weight through super bulky. So let's get started. Just as a place to begin, this is a representation of a web page at the Craft Yarn Council, which outlines some of the criteria of the standard yarn weight system. The Craft Yarn Council is an organization that tries to develop industry standards for a variety of topics relating to knitting and crochet. Things like what are standard abbreviations used in knitting and crochet patterns. They also develop guidelines for finished garment measurements as they relate to standard clothing sizes. So that's the type of thing that the Craft Yarn Council does. I'm going to link to this reference. You'll see at the top here that if we zoom in a little bit, that we've got the numbered system that you'll often find with yarn purchased mainly in larger commercial settings, places like Joann's or Michael's. The brands of yarn sold there will often have these designations, whereas a lot of the independent producers of yarn that you might find in a local yarn shop won't necessarily have these numbers attached to the yarn weights, but we'll talk a little bit about what each of them means. To begin with, we'll look at two examples of a lace weight yarn. Lace weight yarns typically have 800 to 1,000 yards per 100 grams. You will see them knit up at 8 to 10 stitches per inch, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The recommended needle size will often be between a 000, which is a 1.5 millimeter needle, and a US size 1, which is a 2.25 millimeter needle. The crochet gauge for a lace weight yarn is going to be something like 8 to 10.5 double crochets per inch, and that's going to be achieved on a steel size crochet hook size 6 up to a size B hook. In the case of these two yarns, on the left we have Malabrigo lace, which is a single ply merino, and on the right we have Jagger superfine merino, which is a 2-ply yarn. If we look here, we can see that there are 2 plies of yarn twisted together. The Malabrigo lace is 470 yards in a 50-gram hank, and the superfine merino is 560 yards in a 50-gram hank. So you can see that even though they're the same weight of yarn, even though they're going to knit up similarly in some ways, there's more yardage in the superfine merino than there is in the single ply Malabrigo lace. For our fingering weight yarn samples, we also have an example of a single ply versus applied yarn. In this case, the number of plies is greater than with the lace weight. I don't know that I can quite show you here, but this is a 4-ply yarn. And this is Neighborhood Fiber Company Studio Sock, and on the left here is Lady Dye Yarns superwash merino sock, and it's a single ply yarn. Finger and weight yarns you can expect to find somewhere between 400 and 500 yards in a 100-gram skein. You will see them knit up at, say, 7 to 8 stitches per inch on a US 1 or 2.25 millimeter hook up to a US 3 or 3.25 millimeter needle. I said hook before, I meant needle. And in the case of crochet gauge, you will get something like 5.25 to 8 double crochets in an inch on a size B up to an E hook. Our sport weight examples have really different put-ups. The Plymouth Galway Sport is in a 50-gram little skein here, whereas the Elemental Effects Cormo Sport is in a 100-gram, actually it's a 4-ounce, so even a little bit larger than 100-gram skein. So basically the Cormo is roughly twice as much yarn as the Galway Sport. The Galway has 150 yards in that 50-gram skein, whereas the Cormo has about 400 yards in the 4-ounce skein. We can look at some differences between the two yarns here. The Galway Sport is a 2-ply, so just 2 thinner plies of yarn twisted together, whereas the Cormo is a 3-ply. What that means practically is that the Cormo is a much rounder yarn than the Galway Sport is. This is going to be the case in general, that yarns that have odd numbers of plies are going to be rounder than yarns with even numbers of plies. That's the case. A single ply is typically rounder than a 2-ply, and you can apply that as you go along. With sport weight yarns, you will expect to find somewhere between 300 to 400 yards in 100 grams, and the knitted gauge will be approximately 5.75 to 6.25 stitches per inch. And you will expect to possibly get that kind of gauge on a US 3 to a US 5 needle, or 3.25 millimeters to 3.75 millimeters. And double crochets, you'll get 4 to 5 double crochets per inch on a size E up to a 7 hook. And that 7 hook is one of those weird sizes where there's just a number inserted in the middle of the letter range, but it's an oddity, but it's a thing. So that is a look at our sport weight yarns. Okay, the last weight of yarn in our segment here is DK. DK stands for double knitting. It does not refer to the knitting technique where you are making mirror images of a color pattern on both sides of the fabric simultaneously. That is not related. DK yarns, typically you'll find anywhere from, say, 240 yards per 100 grams up to in the neighborhood of 300 yards per 100 grams. On the left-hand side here, we have Malabrigo Silky Merino, and that one has 150 yards in 50 grams. On the right, we have the Plymouth Select DK Merino Superwash, and it has 130 yards per 50 grams. So there's some difference in the yardage between the two, but in many ways they knit fairly similarly gauge-wise. As far as the gauge goes, You can, with a DK yarn, you can expect to get 5.25 stitches to 6 stitches per inch on, say, US 5 or 3.75 millimeter up to size 7 or 4.5 millimeter needles. With the crochet gauge that you might expect with a DK, you're looking at 12 to 17 double crochets over a 4-inch square. So that is going to wrap up the first half of what we're talking about. As you can see, there are 3 main criteria that are going to help you to determine what a yarn weight is. How many yards per 100 grams or per 50 grams, what size needle you might expect to knit it on, and how many stitches per inch. So to summarize, we have some criteria we can apply to determine what the weight of a yarn is. In some cases, we might be looking at a skein that is not labeled in a terribly obvious way. Sometimes you might have yarn that's not labeled at all, but there's some ways that you can determine what weight the yarn might be. First, we have a yardage range for each weight of yarn. That's usually expressed in a range of yards per 100 grams. If you've got a 50-gram skein, of course, you can just double it, and that will give you an idea of where that yarn might fall. You've also got a range of stitch gauge, the number of knitted stitches or double crochets per inch that make a nice fabric with the yarn. And then you've got recommended needle sizes. And again, those are also given as a range. For the purposes of determining yarn weights, those stitch gauges are assumed to be a fairly opaque fabric. Say something that might make a good sweater fabric, so nothing too dense, nothing too loose. But remember that these are starting points for determining what the yarn is. It doesn't mean that that's the only way you can use the yarn. An example of this might be using a fingering weight yarn on much larger needles. So the range for fingering weight yarn is generally a US 1 to a US 3. You might see a shawl pattern that uses a US 6 needle for a much more open and lacy effect, and that is done intentionally. But for the purposes of determining what the yarn weight is, we're looking at a denser fabric. But these are places to start, and once we have the knowledge, then we can branch out from there. Next week I'll be back and we'll talk about the thicker yarns.